Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about humanitarian intervention. Is it a right to protect? But what's humanitarian intervention? It's understood as an option that the international community has to act, sometimes with the use of force, in cases where there is a violation of human rights. But here comes a dilemma. Is intervention a legal and moral right of the international community? Does the international community have an obligation to intervene? Some authors define intervention as dictatorial interference by a state in the face of another state for the purpose of altering the current condition of things. Intervention in the sovereign states is generally prohibited by international law. However, the rule of non-intervention in a sovereign state may cease when humanitarian intervention needs to be applied, which is defined as intervention in the interest of humanity, since this is a peremptory norm or jus cogens.
In fact, humanitarian intervention could be seen under international law as the responsibility to protect. This concept has origins in the doctrine of bellum justum, which initially was not concerned with intervening in other states for humanitarian reasons, but with providing just reasons to an interstate war. It was only by the 16th century, coinciding with the birth of international law, then known as jus gentium or law of nations, under the way of natural law, that support for those suffering from tyranny and maltreatment was seen as one of the reasons for just war.
No, it's possible to define right to protect as the body of a political commitment to end the worst forms of violence and persecution. It seeks to narrow the gap between member states' pre-existing obligation under international humanitarian law and the reality faced by population and rise of genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. It's worth mentioning that there is a responsibility to prevent, on which the UN Security Commission places greater emphasis. When that responsibility fails, the responsibility to react proceeds, which is made up of both non-military and military actions, always considering force as an ultimatum. Finally, once they have reacted, the responsibility to rebuild remains to be fulfilled. Now we have a summary of the responsibilities under international law. Our responsibility rests primarily within the sovereign state. There is the possibility of international assistance to the sovereign state to help the performance of its responsibility. When state responsibility fails and peaceful means are exhausted, the international community must act through the UN Security Council, which means to apply responsibility to protect.
In paragraphs 138 and 139 of the 2005 World Summit Outcome Document, heads of states and government affirmed their responsibility to protect their own population from genocide, war crimes, ethnic clearances, and crimes against humanity, and accept the collective responsibility to encourage and help each other to uphold this commitment.
But what actors can intervene in the humanitarian intervention? Now that we know the meaning of right to protect and humanitarian intervention, it's useful to know who can intervene and why.
The Hague and Geneva Convention comply with the main norms of international humanitarian law. These conventions directly obligate the belligerent state to take the necessary measures for the protection of civilians, wounded soldiers, and medical personnel, but such tasks can be assumed by a protecting power. By a dedicated international organization such as the Red Cross. The mechanism of use depends on the hypothesis in question. According to international law, states, armies, IGOs, NGOs can intervene depending on the case.
To better analyze what has been explained, let's look at the context of Syria and Libya.
Before talking about how the humanitarian intervention was carried out in each case, it is important to know about the context of each country in order to have a better understanding of the reasons that lead to the application of the right to protect concept. In the case of Libya, it is important to start from an event that occurred in January 2011. The beginning of a series of revolts in North African and Middle Eastern countries known as the Arab Spring were caused by the incineration of a chancellor in Tunisia. Then the Ben Ali dictatorship fall, which created different protests in the country region, including Libya. Protests in Libya were repressively controlled using force, leaving thousands of civilians killed by Gaddafi's regime, which provoked the uprising in arms of sectors of the society, plunging Libya into a civil war. The international response to the situation in Libya was generally one of rejection. From regional organizations, the Arabic League vetoed Libya's participation in the organization, and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation rejected the repressive measures that Libya take.
On the other hand, we find the case of Syria, a country located in a complex neighborhood between Turkey, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, and the Mediterranean Sea. Syria also features internal complications that are due to their ethnic divisions. Indeed, the Sunni majority, corresponding to the 74% of the population, must live with other Muslim minorities, such as the Druze and Alawis, as well as with other minorities such as Christians and Kurds. On the other hand, in 1963, the Socialist Arab Renaissance Party, or Ba'ath, came to power and since then ruled Syria under a permanent state of emergency, declaring it a secular, one-party and socialist state. And with that, the Soviet Union became the main supplier of weapons to Syria during the Cold War. In 1970, Hafez al-Assad, a member of Ba'ath, assumed the presidency of the country until his death in 2000. He was succeeded in that year by his son, Bashar al-Assad, in the office up to the present day.
The Assad dynasty has been ruling Syria since 1970. They come from a minority of Alawites, which the Sunni majority resent. In 2000 and 2005, a reform was proposed to the one-party and political system, but they weren't successful. While Assad has systematically weakened the Syrian army for fear of a state coup, at the same time he has strengthened his most loyal forces, such as the Syrian police and the Republican Guard.
Since the Arab Spring, the government has used lethal ammunition, snipers, tanks, and even helicopters in suppressing protests, as well as Arab civilian sympathizers to contribute to the suppression.
The popular protest was quickly escalated into a fully-fledged conflict after a series of loose promises and violent responses, as well as the killings of protesters that were conducted by the government. These events led to thousands of deaths and more than 700,000 displaced due to the excessive use of force by the Syrian government. All of this was evidenced by the United Nations Rights Council in a report published the same year by Human Rights Watch.
Now, in both situations, who intervened and how? Once we speak about the context of each country, it's possible to talk about how the intervention was done, who intervened, and why. In the case of Libya, there are some events and facts that are key in Libya's intervention. One of them was that the Security Council in 2011 approved Resolution 1970, in which it alludes to a right to protect, recalling in its preamble the responsibility of the Libyan authorities to protect their population. In this resolution, the Security Council took measures such as referring the Libyan situation to the Prosecutor of International Criminal Court, imposing an arms embargo, prohibiting travel, and controlling assets of various Libyan authorities.
Another event that marked this intervention was the Security Council approval of the Resolution 1973 on March 17, with the abstention of Russia, China, Brazil, India, and Germany. In this resolution, the responsibility of the Libyan authorities to protect their population was recalled, and the threat to the international peace and security that the situation constitutes. Based on the Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, the Council authorized member states to take all the necessary measures to protect civilian and civilian-populated areas under threat of attack in Libya. In the same resolution, the Council decided to establish a ban on all flights in Libya airspace in order to help protect civilians, authorizing the states parties to adopt all necessary measures to enforce this ban. On March 19, 2011, something important happened as well. The United States, France, and Great Britain began Operation Unified Protector with aerial bombardments against Gaddafi forces. The Allied forces announced that they had cancelled the operation capacity of Libya air forces that had control of the country airspace. After this successful operation, NATO assumed control of all military operations of the member states in and around Libya within the framework of the Unified Protector operation. According to NATO, in its 7 months of military campaign, thousands of operations were carried out so that in October 2011, with their help, the Libyan rebel forces defeated and executed Gaddafi.
On the other hand, we have the case of Syria, a very complex situation like the one that we already spoke about, but with a different approach. In this case, the approach implemented was the Kofi Annan 6-point peace plan in March 2012. The United Nations, supported by the Arab League, launched the 6-point plan as a response for the growing atrocities in Syria. 70 nations were attending the conference, without Russia and China. The essence of the plan was basically addressing the legitimate aspirations and concerns of Syrian people, as well as stop fighting, pull back military concentrations, a commitment to cease fire from every element of the conflict. After that, both Bashar al-Assad regime and the Syrian oppositions agreed on the term and promising a cease of fire. According to some reports, the ceasefire was barely effective, since there are proofs that Syrian army has been shelling in some cities of the country. So on June 16 of 2012, United Nations mission in Syria was suspended as after an escalating violence, and with this marked the failing of Kofi Annan peace initiative. With the failure of Kofi Annan peace plan, the grave atrocities in Syria have been going on for almost 8 years now. While ideally this condition would call for intervention, none has ever been seen in Syria, even when some Security Council initiatives were proposed in the past, but none has passed. No, we can mention that in Syria and Libya cases, the regimes massacred their people, unknowingly tortured, imprisoned, and indiscriminately shot their own people. Furthermore, both cases present similar motives where the civil war was started by young population demanding democracy, eradication of corruption, and well-being. Now, let's take an overview of the results of humanitarian intervention in both cases. In the case of Libya, after NATO intervention, the crisis was not only political but also humanitarian. The rise of militias and autocracies put in risk the security of their neighbor countries and had a high cost in terms of human lives. After the intervention that was supposed to put an end to the humanitarian threat, the resulting civil war has generated a humanitarian crisis that exceeds the situation prior to the intervention in 2011.
But when we speak about the consequences, apparently Syria suffered the most. According to UNHCR, which is the main UN organism in protection of refugees, the civil war in Syria had several negative consequences for the country, especially to their population. As a result of fear and uncertainty, millions of people have left the place where they were born to be asylum in another country.
Now, let's see an overview of the conclusions of all this video.
Once we know better the cases of Libyan and Syrian intervention, it is possible to conclude that humanitarian intervention is not only approved by international law, but also is a duty of states in order to protect human lives. As we mentioned before, humanitarian intervention can have different approaches, as we have been seeing in these cases, but it is up to the international community to apply the most pertinent approach depending on the specific case.
According to the Security Council, humanitarian intervention not necessarily need to be carried out by a single state, but it must be unilateral. Thus, if several states pool their military resources to intervene in a foreign country, that action constitutes a collective intervention. And last but not least, something pretty important to take into account when we speak about humanitarian intervention and the right to protect is that interventionism only takes place when the third state has not given its consent. For example, the case of Libya. If it does, there is no reason from a legal point of view to resort to the concept of humanitarian intervention. Rather, it would be an intervention by invitation. And finally, remember, every man, woman, and child on earth is born free. Thank you for watching.